For people unfamiliar with you, please just tell us your name, a little bit about your background, and really what you've been doing for the last 20 years.
Actually, for 23 years, I've been traveling around the world, speaking on GMOs, writing books, and making movies, and I run an institute called the Institute for Responsible Technology. My name is Jeffrey Smith, and my latest film is called Secret Ingredients, which I did with Amy Hart. And that's available at secretingredientsmovie.com.
What scientific studies have been done on the health impacts of GMOs on our health, and what did the studies show?
There's been numerous studies now that show significant impacts on animals that are force-fed GMOs in feeding trials. Potentially precancerous cell growth in the digestive tract, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, damaged immune system, activated immune system, multiple massive tumors, premature death, significant issues throughout the range of areas that they've tested, including damage to the microbiome. Now, these are not unpredicted because the process of genetic engineering itself causes massive collateral damage within the DNA and can create randomly new toxins, allergens, anti-nutrients, or increased levels of existing toxins, allergens, and anti-nutrients. In addition, GMOs are largely designed to be sprayed with herbicide. Most popularly is Roundup. The Roundup-ready seeds constitute the vast majority of GMOs, more than 80%. Roundup residues end up in the crops, and Roundup is quite dangerous to health. And a lot of research on Roundup also shows significant problems. In fact, Roundup can damage the very foundation of our health. In addition, some crops are called BT crops: corn, cotton, and in South America, some soy. BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, that's soil bacteria. They take a gene from the soil bacteria, insert it into the GMO. It produces a toxin, BT toxin, which kills insects by poking holes in the guts of those insects. Now, they found in laboratory studies it can poke holes in human cells. So it might be causing leaky gut or perforated cells in our gut. It also can provoke an immune system response in animals, and it's been shown to provoke immune system response in workers that are handling the BT. So if you look at the BT toxin, the Roundup, or the GMO itself, they all show significant signs of problems. I had the honor and pleasure of bringing the documented health risks of genetically engineered foods to the medical community by starting in 2006 presentations to medical conferences. And soon after, many of these practitioners were prescribing non-GMO diets to their patients. And around 2008, I heard from some of those doctors who described how their patients got better from a variety of diseases, specifically after they took GMOs out of their diet. And it was predictable. In fact, they were telling me certain disorders or diseases get better in a certain number of days within a particular range with a level of predictability it was uncanny. This was new news to me and to basically everyone because no one knew how sensitive people were to eating GMOs. So I actually started to ask people in my lectures, how many of you noticed an improvement in your health when you switched to a non-GMO and often organic diet? And the hands would go up. So I would say, okay, what changes did you notice? And I asked that same question, and people would say, for example, I have problems with digestion. I said, how many people noticed a problem with digestion? And I'd see the hands. How many people noticed increased or decreased fatigue and decreased brain fog? How many people lost weight? And I was watching these answers, and it was the same basic answers in over 150 lectures, including many lectures to the medical community where I said, on behalf of your patients, what did you notice? So they were representing thousands and thousands of patients. And then we surveyed 3,256 people who reported getting better in 28 conditions, the same conditions that people reported in these lectures, in the same relative order. The number one improvement was always digestive problems. Number two was increased energy, reduced fatigue. Three was weight loss, including relief from obesity, then brain fog, then all sorts of things, food sensitivities, pain, anxiety, depression, autism, cancer, hypertension. And if you look at these particular diseases, many of them are on the rise in parallel with the increased use of GMOs and the Roundup herbicide sprayed on them in the United States. So we have the examples of people getting better from these disorders. We have the correlative evidence supporting the link, doesn't cause it, doesn't prove it, but it supports it. We have similar reports from veterinarians, pet owners, and farmers when they take pets and livestock and put them on non-GMOs. And when you look at the laboratory animals that are force-fed GMOs or Roundup, they exhibit either these conditions or their precursors. Moreover, if you look at the modes of action of Bt toxin, of Roundup, and also the process of genetic engineering itself, you could predict these particular set of diseases. And I'm talking about the major diseases we're facing in society. So when you take a look at the whole body of evidence and the repeating patterns, it's pretty significant. In fact, I don't think we need to wait for more evidence to immediately eliminate GMOs and Roundup from our diets. Now, it used to be that I'd say, eat GMOs, and if you can, eat organic. Then you get all the benefits of organic. Now we understand that Roundup is sprayed on a lot of non-GMOs. It's sprayed on wheat, oats, barley, all the cereals or grains. It's sprayed on lentils and mung beans. It's sprayed on potatoes and sweet potato fields. It's throughout our food supply, except in the organic field. So now I say, eat organic, and if you can't eat organic, at least eat non-GMO.
Are we winning or losing the fight against GMOs? And what's the number one thing people can do to stop the spread of GMOs?
We're winning the fight against GMOs, and that's because the one thing people can do that's more important than anything else is to stop eating them. And the accumulation of the people who are now seeking non-GMO is so great that the food companies realize they must eliminate GMOs from their brands in order to compete with the competing brand that has the non-GMO label on the same shelf. In fact, surveys show that 46% of Americans say they're seeking non-GMO food. Now, I guess that the actual number of people that do what they say is less, but I think we have more people than we need, and the tipping point is underway. Now, we need to realize also that the biotech industry, who's famous for trying to cover up problems and disinform, they have a new campaign to disinform. And that campaign is built around gene editing. CRISPR-Cas9 is one example you may have heard of in the news. And they try to claim that this is not a GMO. In fact, it's so precise and so predictable, we should just call it breeding and ignore it. Please don't ignore it. Research has shown that the process of editing genes, as well as the tissue culture used right afterwards to create the GMO, and sometimes they transfer the gene-edited substance, all of that creates massive collateral damage in the DNA, and any one of those mutations may be serious for health. And yet there's many, many mutations that occur as a result of this process. And the biotech industry is ignoring those largely. In fact, they're using the same rhetoric that they used 25 years ago, saying, oh, genetic engineering is so precise and so predictable, we should just ignore it and not regulate it. Well, unfortunately, CRISPR-Cas9 and other gene editing techniques are so inexpensive that any facility with a laboratory can genetically engineer products almost at no cost. And yet there is a big advantage if you can put a patented GMO in the market and make money before the patent expires. And so what we have is a gold rush into the genome, a gene rush. And everything with DNA is targeted. So if we are not vigilant, then the biotech industry could literally replace nature, eliminate the products of the billions of years of evolution, and replace it with designer organisms released into the environment, which then self-propagate in the gene pool. So that means all future generations after this one may inherit the travesty of a technology that's most common result is unpredicted side effects. And these side effects are multiplied when you put them in the environment, because you have side effects within the organism, and then you have side effects in their interactions with the complex food and ecological web. So we're at a very important turning point, or not. Are we going to turn away from nature and eliminate what we have been given from previous generations and turn it over to a Monsanto/Bayer version of reality? Or are we going to protect the genetic integrity? And the number one thing people can do is to avoid GMOs and to share this information with others. it is interesting that it's kind of a responsibility for us now that this technology is available, but it's also a opportunity, because no other technology in history has been able to negatively affect all living beings and all future generations, and so we get the ability to protect all living beings and all future generations.
When you go in the grocery, you're seeing, as you said, more and more non-GMO products. People are getting more and more hip to this and starting to buy those products. Can they label something as non-GMO when the reality is they're just doing the same old thing anyway and they're just marketing it that way?
There are many non-GMO labels on the market. The one that I look for is Non-GMO Project Verified. That's a third-party organization. They require, if there's any at-risk ingredients in the final product, that the inputs get tested, and tested by a credentialed laboratory. They have a document review. They have visits. So I recommend the Non-GMO Project Verification Program. There's also what we call self-certification, where a company may just slap a non-GMO on their box. And I remember Cheerios did that in the early 2014, and I called them up and said, "What's your criteria?" And they wouldn't tell me. So Trader Joe's said, "We don't allow the use of GMOs in our named brands that say Trader Joe's." And I'm seeing high fructose corn syrup, and I'm thinking, well, what do they do? And what's their testing procedure? They don't release that either. So we are frustrated by companies that don't give us the details. We consistently ask them to turn over the details. We're grateful that they're taking attempts to avoid GMOs, but we're not fully satisfied with their label.
Tell us about this $289 million verdict against Bayer. What does it mean, and does it affect the industry?
Monsanto was purchased by Bayer, the aspirin company, but they also have a crop division that sells GMOs and herbicides, etc. And when they were looking to purchase Monsanto, I released a document for their shareholders pointing out about 10 areas where there was high-risk exposure that they weren't taking into consideration. And one of those was the health dangers and the cancer determination. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, a branch of the World Health Organization, had determined that glyphosate, which is the chief poison in Roundup, was a class 2A carcinogen, a probable human carcinogen. And the strongest evidence was about non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Well, the lawyers got hold of it, and that was a good thing. And they represented a groundskeeper, Lee Johnson, from the Bay Area in California, who had been exposed to Roundup while he was a groundskeeper. He was, I think, delivering as much as, 150 gallons a day on the days that he was spraying. The wind would blow it into his face. One time the hose broke and he got drenched. Another time his backpack broke and he got drenched in the back. And he ended up calling the company hotline, a couple of times, reaching out saying, "Is there any connection? Because I have rashes, now I have cancer, is there any connection?" And even after the International Agency for Research on Cancer determined that glyphosate was a probable human carcinogen, 2 weeks after that, he called and was never told about the link and continued to use Roundup. And his situation changed from a curable cancer to a supposedly incurable terminal cancer. And so they rushed his trial while he was still alive, and he is still alive at this point. And it was interesting. I interviewed the chief attorney, Brent Wisner, and on our site, responsibletechnology.org, I strongly recommend. It's fascinating, it's entertaining, some people call it life-changing, to watch these 6-part, or now probably more than that, interview with Brent Wisner. He's amazing. I was on the Doctor's TV show with him for a full episode arguing about the problems with the cancer-causing glyphosate and revealing the secret documents from Monsanto that he was able to force into public domain. There's a whole story about that. You got to catch that. And I was there during the closing arguments that were very dramatic and reported on it in live Facebook at the Institute for Responsible Technology Facebook page. And when the jury verdict was read, it was a shot heard round the world. They awarded in compensatory damages, which is the actual cost to Lee of $38 million, and then, or 39, and then the punitive damages was $250 million. So the total is $289 million. Now the judge later reduced it to a total of about $78 million. But nonetheless, when the $289 million was announced, soon after the bear capitalization, the stock prices dropped by 20 to 30%. $20 billion drop on a 200, because they have nearly 10,000 other plaintiffs waiting in the wings. Now, at one point, a judge said that they were going to limit the evidence that was available to the jury in future trials, and Bayer's stock price went up 7%. And then another judge just recently said, in at least the trials that he oversees, that he was going to allow more evidence than the other judge said. And I haven't seen the stock prices change, but it is very significant because it actually represents an incredible opportunity for the makers of Roundup and the liars about Roundup to pay out to those who've suffered from their lies. And there's a lot of very serious issues. I mean, Lee Johnson is supposed to die soon, and I've met him, and it's a very sad thing. And the victory in the courts is a magnificent thing because that can help prevent other sad situations. And between the announcement by the International Agency for Research on Cancer in 2015 and this announcement by the jury, it's a shot heard around the world, and people now realize that Roundup is linked to cancer, in spite of the fact that Monsanto's people at the EPA, and I'm using that very specifically, watch that interview to find out how they have a lapdog in the EPA that they were working with, and he was going back and forth with texting, and they were talking about him by email, and he was clearly a Monsanto man in charge of the EPA's determination of whether glyphosate was caused cancer, and of course he said it didn't, and he even helped stop another agency from doing research on the same thing, and said if I can stop it, I deserve a medal. So you can know where his thinking is. So they've created a controversy, and a recent study has shown that the EPA and the European regulators specifically cherry-picked the data by looking at almost entirely for their decisions unpublished industry research, whereas the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC, looked at published studies. And the vast majority of the published studies showed toxicity to the DNA, and only one of the industry studies of about 99 showed that there was toxicity to the DNA. And so they came to different conclusions because it was designed to come to different conclusions. They cherry-picked the data specifically to ignore the evidence. And there's many other details in terms of how they ignored it, and we've caught them red-handed. So this is an important development. That the courts are now moving the needle on glyphosate, Roundup, and because most GMOs are Roundup ready, it's also moving the needle on GMOs as well.
If someone is against GMOs, are they better off voting Republican or Democrat?
They're better off voting with their dollar. It's interesting. The Democrats and the Republicans, both the presidents since Reagan, have been pro-GMO. The Obama administration was worse than the previous Bush administration on GMOs, and Trump is no better than Obama. There's been a lockdown in Washington, both at the executive level and the congressional level. And even the Supreme Court has Clarence Thomas, who was a former Monsanto attorney. So we are not set up to win in Washington right now. The USDA under Trump released a fake labeling bill, one that basically deceives every American and works on behalf of the biotech industry. I've written about it. We have a petition at responsibletechnology.org. Please go there and sign it. And the petitions usually don't have much impact, but this one is not only aimed at the White House and the USDA, but it's aimed at the food companies, because in the petition we give them information about how this labeling, this fake labeling deal, will actually hurt their interests. And I'm sure they never thought of it, so please go there and learn about the fake labeling bill under the Trump USDA. But I can't single out Trump or Obama or Bush or Clinton. They all have been pushing the GMO agenda. And I can give specific examples, but just assume that it's outside the apparatus of US politics in the federal level where we're going to win. And we used to think that the state level would have a lot of power for us because we had state ballot initiatives for labeling. The representatives of Vermont passed a labeling bill, and of course the Congress rushed in and preempted state labeling bills and ballot initiatives, saying no state can require labeling of GMOs. It's going to be a national thing, and we give it to the USDA to determine it over 2 years, and that's what they did. They came up with a fake labeling bill. So what's great about the GMO campaigning for me is that you don't actually have to change government policy in order to win. The European Commission, for example, is pro-GMO, and so is their version of the FDA, the European Food Safety Authority. But they don't sell GMOs in the food supply except through animal feed, because the people learned about them because of an open media and a big scandal that happened in 1999 about food safety that no one in the US knows about. And because there was so much concern about GMOs among the population, the food companies, not the government, banned GMOs from their food supply. Unilever, April 27th, 1999. Nestle's, April 28th. Everyone else within a couple of weeks. 1999, in Europe, but not here. The same companies that banned it there continued to sell the unsuspecting Americans the GMOs that the Europeans had rejected.
There are stories out there that Monsanto does what it can to hush their opposition. Surely you've been under, I don't want to use the word attack, but can you tell us anything about your experiences in terms of, you having this voice against these folks, and what have you experienced from them?
Well, when Boy Scouts get merit badges for doing certain things, I got my merit badge when Monsanto started to attack me. It's like I was exposing how they were suppressing evidence, attacking and threatening scientists, getting people fired, covering up. And I was just sort of biding my time, waiting until, obviously it was on their radar. I had the world's best-selling book on GMOs, Seeds of Deception. I'd been traveling to 25 countries by this time. And then I came out with the book Genetic Roulette, which was a compilation of all the health dangers. And people were using that all over the world as kind of like the Bible, because it was all the different health dangers, I could gather from all the different scientists around the world. And then what they did is they paid some of their so-called scientists to come up with a hit website that supposedly showed that my evidence was wrong. But what it did is it showed how they distorted and denied. By even after 3 years that it was on the market, they published a rebuttal that misquoted or mischaracterized the book in order for them to make their arguments. So they came up with a fake website at great expense. They did probably hired private investigators to look at my past and tried to find skeletons. They found out that I meditate and that I dance. So they tried to use that against me. So at this point, they have a very specific structure, a line item in their budget called Let Nothing Go. And anytime someone posts something on Facebook, one of their thousands of trolls will comment and try and shame them and make it unpopular. When a scientist comes up with something, they'll gather the troops and try and suppress that. I think I'm targeted by that same budget line item, and I actually ignore it. I don't read the articles written by the people that get money from Monsanto, and they try to hide the fact that they're getting money, and we've been able to actually verify that they are being paid. They're paid agents. And so I don't bother reading them or replying to them. What I do is get my word out to millions and help move the markets by telling the truth. And if a dozen people think that I'm a bad person because I'm me calling for more science, if they want to call me anti-science, That's fine. So I want to bring this up that a lot of people listening will want to share what they've heard about GMOs on their social media. And I think it's in Huffington Post, an article about the trolls, the people hired by Monsanto Bayer to shame you if you do such that. If you post something, you may get someone that looks like a real person, but they have a fake name and they have an argument which is designed to make you sound wrong. So this shaming technique works in human nature. It's been the basis of so many corporate and political and religious campaigns through history because people shrink from that shaming. And now with social media, it's kind of a public shaming. So I'm going to ask people not to be susceptible. That when you get shamed, make it your merit badge. Aha! We found a troll. You can link to my troll article and say, aha, we found a troll. Go here, go here. If you run your own Facebook page, just kick them out. Just take them out. They don't deserve your time or attention or the attention of the people that read your posts. So I wanted to suggest that people just flip the whole energy around this public shaming. No constriction, no fear. Actually wear it as a merit badge and say, aha, I'm making enough, stirring enough of the pot so I'm getting the attention. Now, not everyone that posts negatively is a troll. There's the liars and the lied to. And sometimes the lied to will just pick up the same energy and say, yes, this is wrong, because that's what they've been told. But we have documented all of the myths and truths. There's even a book called GMO Myths and Truths online, which I recommend, written by friends of mine. There is so much evidence now supporting our case and completely undermining their case that we actually have the truth on our side.
Right now, who in the United States government is in charge of the approvals of GMOs? Is this person from the biotech industry, and are they protecting the biotech industry or the people?
In the early 90s, the White House had instructed the FDA to promote GMOs. And so the FDA created a new position specifically for Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney, to be in charge. And the policy that he created said that the companies themselves were in charge of determining whether their foods are safe. They could submit a voluntary consultation process to the FDA, giving whatever they wanted to give. If the FDA asked them questions, they could ignore the questions. And at the end of this meaningless exercise, the FDA would write a letter to them, and the letter would not say the FDA confirms the safety of your food. The FDA wrote the letter saying, this is to confirm that you believe your foods are safe. It just was a complete bureaucratic cover-up of any real evaluation. And the FDA has never received a single dossier with sufficient evidence of the raw data to evaluate, except the first one, which was for a flavor saver tomato, and we have the documents by the FDA scientists saying this does not show safety. There was stomach lesions and deaths, etc., among these rats, and after that, no company ever submitted detailed data to the FDA. So the FDA is not in charge. The EPA is in charge if you have a product that produces an insecticide, like the BT crops. They'll just look at the BT portion of it. They won't look at the whole GMO. So it's really like reductionist science to its max, very dangerous way of evaluating. Or they'll look at the herbicide that's sprayed on the Roundup ready crops, for example, the Roundup, and approve that, so that's fine. So they basically, and they specifically don't look at the full Roundup. They look at just the glyphosate, even though Roundup is 125 times or up to 125 times more toxic than glyphosate. They don't look at low dose effects, even though the amount of glyphosate necessary to create non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in rats was on a per body weight basis, on a per day consumption, these rats had so little Roundup that the EPA allows 437,000 times more consumed by humans on a per body weight, per day basis, because they don't look at the low dose effects. So the EPA is basically working with science that's 20 years old on purpose for the benefit of the companies that have their products submitted. And we have evidence that they know that and that they're ignoring it. So the EPA is in charge of a very small slice of the pie. And the USDA looks at, when the White House told the FDA and the regulatory agencies to promote GMOs, they said, we don't want, they didn't say this, but we know, they did not want Congress to pass new laws. So they jerry-rigged existing laws and say, just regulate it based on existing laws. And so the USDA has laws about invasive species. And so, okay, let's talk about invasive species. Well, we know bacteria and viruses can be invasive. And the GMOs that are on the market have bacterial genes or viral genes. Okay, that's the excuse. So now with gene editing, all the company has to do is send a letter to the USDA and say, we're not using any genetic material from bacteria or viruses. You don't really have to look at us, do you? And they'll say, no, it's not our jurisdiction. We have no laws regarding that. And so they ignore, I mean, they could more widely interpret the law, but they don't. So there's no one home at the USDA. And for gene editing, no one looks at it. Not the USDA, not the EPA, not the FDA, no one. So who's in charge of approving? The answer is the companies.
Aside from plants, are there other living items like trees, insects, and animals where you're concerned that genetic modification will cause problems?
Right now, everything with DNA is being targeted. The gene editing technique is so inexpensive that they want to basically patent anything with DNA, get it out there and make money. There's a company called Oxitec, which has genetically modified mosquitoes, designed to kill off the population of the mosquito that carries dengue and Zika. And I remember testifying at a mosquito control board in Key West because they wanted to release it in the Keys. And a scientist, so-called scientist from Oxitec, was speaking as well. And afterwards I asked Derek, I said, have you tested to see if the saliva of the mosquitoes that bite humans is altered because of the genetic engineering process? Obviously, if it is altered, it gets in our bloodstream, and that could be a problem. He said, we're just now looking to see if the protein produced by the inserted gene is expressed in the saliva. And I'm thinking, a little late, buddy. You've already released millions of mosquitoes in 4 countries, and you've never looked at the portion of the mosquito that gets into human blood. You're an idiot. But I actually, in poker, I see you and raise you. I said, Derek, there was a study done on human cells where they inserted a single gene, and up to 5% of the functioning genes in that cell changed their levels of expression, producing more proteins, less proteins, switching on, switching off. Wouldn't it make sense to do a complete analysis of the saliva and not just look for one protein? And his response was, good idea. So these are the brain cells behind genetically modified mosquitoes. And it's interesting, they got kicked out of the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Islands, they were going to do an island-wide release. And they decided, well, let's do one more trial. So they did a trial, and it was a failure. So then Oxitec convinced them to pay for another trial. They did another trial, and quietly Oxitec just left town, fired all their employees, and we understand that it was a failure as well. So their response is, oh, now we have 2.0. Now we have a different technology in our mosquitoes and it turns out there's other techniques that are way safer and way less controversial that many countries are doing. And Oxitec has all these different types of insects in their pipeline trying to basically take over the insect market. There's genetically modified fish being sold in Canada, which might cause increased allergic reactions, might be linked to cancer. We have higher levels of IGF-1 in the fish, higher reactivity in the allergic reaction test, but the numbers were so small it wasn't statistically significant. I mean, I think that it was a significant increase if you look simply at the 25% or 50% increase, but they used so few numbers as if to ensure that they showed no safety concerns, and yet they're releasing this food to the public. It's already being eaten in Canada. There's genetically modified trees. There's over 1 million GM poplars, I think, planted in China, and they don't know exactly where they are and which ones are genetically engineered. There was a study that just came out this week saying that if they genetically engineer the American chestnut, there's no plan, there's no way that they can control that. You see, once you release a GMO into the environment, it cross-pollinates, it produces offspring, and it is part of the gene pool. And when you have a tree where pollen can fly for miles and there's a whole ecosystem in the bark and in the leaves and underneath, you're affecting an enormous amount. And trees and forests affect the weather. If you denude a land from a forest, you'll change the weather. You'll change the runoff. It can be a disaster, and we've seen that time and time again. And yet they're releasing trees that are less stiff, lower lignin count. It's trees that can kill insects, which changes the whole ecosystem. Basically for lumber. They're turning these beings of trees into lumber. They don't think in terms of nature. They think in terms of industry. So, for example, they want to genetically engineer out the mothering instinct of livestock. So you can take the children away from the mothers, the cows, etc., and they won't notice. They don't care. Because rather than making agriculture, but industry to fit agriculture, they're making agriculture to fit industry. So they want to genetically engineer algae, bacteria, fungus. There's been a glowfish on the market you can buy as a pet that glows in the dark. They've made puppies and cats glow in the dark in laboratories. It's amazing. But what's amazing is the disrespect for what we don't know. For years, scientists believed that one gene created one protein, created one trait. That was wrong. They also felt like because the functioning genes that produce proteins were only maybe 2% of our genome, 98% of our DNA they considered junk genes. Now they realize those are important. They said RNA, just a way station between DNA, RNA, and protein. Now it turns out RNA creates all sorts of regulatory changes. It is so much more complicated than they thought. It's not rocket science, it's way more complicated. And yet, in the face of that level of complexity, they dumb it down and say, well, we can take a gene out of this species and put it in here or change this, and these changes will happen, and we don't know exactly what will happen, but we'll assume that that's okay. And we'll release it into the environment so it's permanently part of nature, and we'll feed it to people.
Are there other techniques not called genetic modification that in effect manipulate the genetics of the plant that you are concerned about?
There's ways of mutating genes through chemicals or radiation. Canola, for example, was oilseed rape, where they took the seeds and exposed it to radiation so that the new plants produced a lower amount of a toxin that was deadly, and so they called that a healthy plant and a healthy oil. And there's very little follow-up and research into what other things might have changed, etc. So I am concerned about what's called mutagenesis and chemical mutagenesis, etc. But it's not my area of expertise. My focus has been on genetic engineering, which is the transfer of genes from one species, the gene editing, etc. And there's plenty of evidence showing that those are dangerous.
Aren't GMOs helping us to feed the world?
No, GMOs are not helping us to feed the world. Next question. Actually, let me go more detailed into that. This is the lie that Monsanto dreamed up by their PR firm to try and create guilt among Europeans and Americans so that we would accept their faulty, dangerous, unsafe technology because someday it might actually help feed the world. Well, first of all, GMOs do not increase yield. On average, it's the same or in some cases less. And agroecology, which was recommended by the hundreds of scientists that did the most comprehensive evaluation in terms of how to feed the world for the UN, the ISTAD report, said agroecology is the way forward. They dismissed GMOs as being essentially irrelevant to the question of how to feed the world. Whereas agroecology can double yields, GMOs basically have no measurable average increase in yield. Now, it's also true that increased yield was not the way to feed the world, because we have more food per person than any time in human history. Enough food to feed 11 billion people, I'm told, and yet close to 1 billion people go to bed hungry or malnourished every night. So increasing production is not the silver bullet according to the experts. It's access, it's distribution. There's a lot of complex elements. And so to try and promote a silver bullet that's actually a faulty silver bullet, it doesn't actually increase yields, and it's dangerous, and it creates a dependence on corporations by developing countries, and it wipes out biodiversity. And there's all sorts of things that's bad. But even simply to push it forward as the technology to cure hunger takes money away from the real solutions. So Bill Gates was approached by the Rockefeller Foundation, a very big pro-GMO foundation, and he was convinced and insulated people around him, or the Monsanto yes men, and now he's giving millions of dollars to the technology for Africa and ignoring technologies that actually work, and going for technologies that fail time and again, and then put people at risk if they were to eat these products. So it actually works against feeding the hungry world.
Are organic farmers able to protect their farms from being contaminated by GMO crops grown elsewhere?
The nature of nature is abundance and sharing, and when you plant GM corn upwind and it blows during the time that the pollen is available, if your corn is downwind, you will get cross-pollinated, you'll get contaminated. Now you can choose corn that tassels at a different time than the corn upwind, so maybe there's no fertilization, if that's the word, at the time. You can choose to move your crop. You can have buffer zones. But there is the capacity to contaminate in the field, during transport, in storage. And so sometimes you'll find that there is a small percentage of GMO contamination. And the contamination is higher for corn than it is for soybeans, because corn cross-pollinates and soybeans do not readily cross-pollinate. They, in a small distance perhaps. So we have a situation where, even though organic is not a foolproof area, it's the better choice. Now, non-GMO project verification requires testing if there's at-risk ingredients to see if contamination has occurred, and has a 0.9% threshold. Organic has no testing requirement, but it doesn't allow GMOs or Roundup or other toxic chemicals. So I say organic is more important than non-GMO project verified, because you avoid the GMOs and the chemicals. But the two together is the gold standard, because then you have the testing from the non-GMO project requirements, as well as all the prohibitions of organic. So non-GMO project verified plus organic on the same package, the gold standard. If you have to choose between one or the other, I say organic, and if you can't get organic, at least get non-GMO.
Are there GMO studies that show that GMOs are safe? And if so, were these independent or industry studies?
There's no research that can prove something is safe. There's no research that has been available that proved that GMOs were safe. We have a whole body of evidence produced by the biotech companies that I call rigged research. They've got bad science down to a science. They use the wrong detection methods, the wrong statistics, they overcook samples, they ignore evidence and call it not biologically significant or not treatment related without any justification. They have an entire lexicon, they have an entire vocabulary and a way of corrupting science that has become the norm now. And I've spoken to real scientists who are like pulling their hair out saying, this is not how science is done. And yet that's how the biotech science is done. In my book, Genetic Roulette, in part 3, it's 41 pages, catching the industry red-handed, showing how they rig their research. And it is amazing, it is blatant. Sometimes it's how they rig the research, and sometimes it's their completely ridiculous statements and assumptions. I'll give one example because I like it so much. They were submitting a corn to Australia and New Zealand that was genetically engineered to produce more lysine so they can feed it to pigs, and so the pigs would have lysine built into the corn instead of just adding the supplement lysine into their feed. Oh good, we can ignore, it's like, fine, we can ignore giving them lysine if we have this corn, and it's so necessary to feed the world. And it produced a protein that was found in soil. And they said, well, because the protein is found in soil, and we eat soil residues in the food, it has a history of safe use in the food supply. So it should be just accepted as safe because we've been eating soil for years, for centuries. So Jack Heinemann, a scientist and professor in New Zealand, called their bluff and looked up what the average corn consumption was for a US male adult, and figured out if that corn were the high lysine corn that was being submitted, how much of that protein would be consumed per day. And then he figured out how much of that protein is found in soil, and how much soil that same average male adult would have to consume per day in order to have an equivalent dose. And it was 22,000 pounds of soil per second. You'd have to be consuming 22,000 pounds of soil per second, every second of the day, to get the same amount of protein that you would if you ate Monsanto's corn on an average corn-consuming day. I mean, I love that in that example because it's so absurd. And yet these are the kind of arguments. And it is ridiculous how well they fly in the regulatory agencies that are largely staffed with the biotech appointments. And I've talked to them, and some of them are really not very aware of the situation. I won't call them unintelligent, but they're certainly ignorant. And I remember talking to one of the top scientists in the world, Dr. P.M. Bhargava, who was asked by the Indian Supreme Court to sit on the approval committee and see if, in fact, it was a facade. According to a citizen's petition, that's what was claimed. And after 10 months, he said, yes, it's a facade. And he told me, we did a press conference in Delhi. He said, it's every single submission, any evidence of problems, they would say it's discredited. No matter what journal it was put in, no matter who did it, they just said it's discredited. And when he came out with his report and sent it to the Supreme Court and sent it to the Health Ministry and the Prime Minister, the same committee tried to discredit him and said he has no research in DNA and RNA. He actually had more DNA and RNA research than the entire committee put together. And he, it was a ridiculous thing. He laughed about how he was being treated by these people who he had caught red-handed, lying and covering up and ignoring the evidence.
Are there health risks from eating genetically modified corn? And if there are, what are they?
Corn is genetically engineered, over 90% of it. And corn on the cob, it's less than 90%. But corn on the cob that's genetically engineered may be one of the worst GMOs to consume because it has many different genes put in there, and it has Bt toxin. Bt toxin has been shown to create immune responses in farm workers that use Bt in its natural state, and this is thousands of times more concentrated. It's been found to poke holes in human cells in laboratories. It's been found in the blood of 93% of the pregnant women tested in Canada, which means that it gets into their fetus as well, and maybe get into the brain of the fetus because there's no blood-brain barrier. So you have the Bt toxin, and then it's sprayed with Roundup. And the Roundup can damage the very foundations of our health. And on top of that, you have the genetic engineering problems. The genetic engineered corn, one of Monsanto's Bt corns, for example, has a new allergen that's not found in the normal corn. The Roundup Ready corn has higher levels of putrescine and cadaverine, which I love those names. They are responsible for the foul odor of rotting dead bodies. They can lead to bad breath, but they're also linked to cancer and allergies. So you have the damage as a result of the DNA changes, and with raw corn or with corn, it's not cooked well. So you don't end up eliminating the proteins. You don't end up destroying the proteins. You just cook it for a few minutes, eat it, and you get all the toxins. Now, what may be worse than the corn are the genetically engineered apples and potatoes. These were introduced more recently. They are designed not to turn brown when sliced. And they use double-stranded RNA technology. Little pieces of RNA are produced by the inserted gene, and they silence genes. Now, we know from research that, for example, a mouse can eat double-stranded RNA in a meal and have that mouse and have his DNA silenced. We know that honeybees, when they had one single meal in the larva stage, one single meal of double-stranded RNA, it changed the expression of about 10% of their genome, over 1,400 genes. So I say don't eat the apple or the potato because it might reprogram your DNA.
Are you in favor of any GMO crops?
Our Institute for Responsible Technology is very specific. We're against the use of GMOs in food, and we're against the outdoor release of GMOs. Why is that? This is an infant technology that is prone to side effects, and its basic assumptions that were used as a basis for safety claims have proven untrue over and over again. They're constantly finding new nuances in the complex ways that the DNA and RNA and proteins, etc., function within the cell and work within the organism. And to release a GMO into the environment where it can self-replicate and become part of the new nature is completely irresponsible at this point in our understanding. And to release it into the food supply is similarly irresponsible because of the predicted unpredicted side effects. If you keep it in a laboratory for research, for manufacturing purposes, etc., and it's contained, we don't have a policy against that. But we don't want this dangerous technology released.
What scientific studies have been done on the environmental impacts of GMOs on our planet and food system? What did the studies show?
It's important to understand, before we go into the details of the soil problems and the non-target insects, etc., that pollution of the gene pool is irreversible. If you introduce a gene into a crop and it cross-pollinates and you release it outdoors, for example, Starlink corn. I used to work at a laboratory that detected for GMOs. I was the vice president of marketing. I got a call from the laboratory director. We found Starlink corn in taco shells. And I said, test it again, don't tell the client. It turns out it was illegal in human food, and it resulted in over $1 billion recall, and countries all over the world stopped importing U.S. corn because it might have Starlink that was a likely human allergen, medium probability, and it wasn't ever supposed to be part of the human food supply. And they found Starlink in, I think, 22% of all the samples tested that year. And after 3 years of very intense remediation and whatnot, they still found it. It was only like in 1.8%, but they still found it in the gene pool. It's still in the gene pool. It may forever be in the corn gene pool. And as we introduce more and more non-GM corn, the percentage may go down and down and down, but it's still there. We can't do a hunt and gather, a search and rescue, an elimination. We can't do that with current technology to eliminate the gene that was inserted into corn that may be a human allergen, that may have caused people to have anaphylactic shock, that may still be killing people. So this is a kind of pollution that is unlike anything we've seen before. And it's a change not only that can affect human health, but it can affect the environment. Because again, if there's a change in that crop, in that species, it gives it a survival advantage, that gives it some other aspect, it's there forever, interacting with millions of other factors in the environment. Now, what do we know about the environmental risks? Quite a bit. Roundup is doused on Roundup-ready crops. Roundup is an antibiotic. It kills the beneficial bacteria in the soil. It promotes fungal pathogens. So more than, I think, 60 different plant diseases are rising in the U.S. because of Roundup, because it promotes fungal growth. It takes the minerals out of the plants, makes them weak, which changes the whole ecosystem because the ecosystem that relies on the nutrients of the plants becomes weakened. The Roundup can remain stable in the soil for years or decades. The longest reported half-life, the time it takes for it to be degraded into 50%, was 22 years. It's usually not that long, but it depends on the nature of the soil. It compactifies the soil, so it creates more runoff. This is Roundup. It has phosphorus, so that helps create dead zones, and that also runs off. The Bt toxin can bind with clay and be stable for a long time. It can damage the ecosystem of rivers and marine ecosystem because it damages the caddisfly, and it can influence the health of non-target beneficial insects. The salmon that's genetically engineered and sold in Canada, a similar salmon was found that when in a study in times of low food, when they didn't feed it enough because it was growing so fast and was ravenous, it would become aggressive and kill and eat its fellow salmon, causing complete extinctions in the tank or near extinctions. There's so many different areas. I mean, I could go on because what we have here is a technology which changes the nature of the species, adds intense amount of poisons, and can even change the fertility of the soil. Sometimes after Roundup is sprayed, after GMOs are planted, then the next generation or the next crop that's planted does poorly or is unable to grow at all. We've heard both situations. So it's pretty extensive, the damage that we've already seen. And they want to introduce yet more types of GMOs. And so we're looking at potential catastrophes. In addition, you get these things where, these afterthoughts. When Bt toxin was introduced in corn, they discovered, a certain variety kills monarch butterflies. So they quietly removed that. But then the Roundup-ready crops, they spray vast amounts in the Midwest with Roundup. It kills the milkweed plant, which is where the larvae are deposited, and they eat the milkweed. So now that has resulted in a catastrophic reduction in the monarch butterfly, over 90% reduction, I'm told. And then they find that glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, can cause damage to bees, causing bee deaths and inability to navigate back to the hive. One research group was studying this, and it was bought by Monsanto, called Biologics. So we don't hear about that research anymore from Biologics. So it's pretty comprehensive in how it can devastate. I think the last thing is that because it is an antibiotic, we have no idea how important the microbiome is. There are some scientists that talk about the efficacy of herbs and even of salad may be the microbiome on the leaves more than the actual substance, the particular microbiome. And I can have a whole discussion about that. But the microbiome can be wiped out by antibiotics. And the biggest application of antibiotics in the world is Roundup and glyphosate-based herbicides with an antibiotic that's known to kill beneficial bacteria, but not the nasty stuff.
Tell us about the dangers of Roundup.
Roundup damages the fundamental foundations of our health. If you look at the charts of diseases rising in the United States, more than 30 of them are rising in parallel with the increased use of Roundup sprayed on GMOs or on the increased acreage of GMOs. But Roundup in particular is identified as a likely cause of many of these particular diseases. Now, why is that? It chelates minerals, making them less available, and without proper minerals, there's whole metabolic pathways that just shut down. They go on strike. They do nothing without their cofactor mineral. So you have whole shutdown of very important things like the shikimate pathway, which produce the precursors to serotonin, melatonin, and dopamine. So now you may have a deficit of important neurotransmitters that affect your mind and your sleep and your pain and your anxiety and maybe schizophrenia. And all these are related to, in terms of the correlative charts, which don't prove anything, but now we have plausible causative pathways that show how Roundup and glyphosate may be causing these things. So you have the mineral deficiency. It's an antibiotic. It kills the beneficial bacteria in the soil. It might cause a dysbiosis, a change in the balance of the bacteria of the body, which can lead to numerous diseases. It can cause gaps between cells in the body, turning our organs and tissues into sponges for toxins. And in the case of the gut, leaky gut. Leaky gut is linked to a long list of diseases, including autism, cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, autoimmune disease, inflammation, and allergies. It also is a probable class 2A carcinogen, and it's linked to many different cancers. It also is linked to genotoxicity, damage to the DNA, and oxidative stress, which both can create cancer. It is a mitochondrial toxin. Mitochondria health is related to aging, to cancer, to all sorts of diseases, and it is damaged by Roundup. It suppresses digestive enzymes. It damages the villi along the intestines. It can lead to birth defects. There's been a great study on that. So it is, and it also can mess up our hormones, including potentially the balance between testosterone and estrogen, which is very important. And it's linked to damage to sperm cells in mice, to high rates of death in lab animals. So we're in a situation where if you look at the nature of this molecule, which is unique, it's as if it kicks the foundation out of our health. Because each of these things that I mentioned, from the mineralization to the microbiome to the mitochondria to hormones to neurotransmitters, these are the foundational elements of our health. And Roundup is sprayed on a lot of different crops, not just GMOs. So that's why eating organic is really important. And at rounduprisks.com, we have a little training there, how you can get Roundup kicked out of your homeowners association, golf course, school, park, cities, not just Roundup, but other toxic herbicides, and be replaced by non-toxic, cost-beneficial alternatives.
What you see is the importance of the Real Truth About Health conference.
When Stephen told me he had an idea for a 10-day free conference called The Real Truth About Health, I was upset. I said, who is going to be coming to the conference for 10 days? No one has that time. But what it's evolved to is a platform for release of videos. And you have as many as 300,000 now, 300,000 views for a single video. So I kept complaining, saying, I don't think it's a good idea. You don't want to bring people from all over the world and have a small audience, and no one's going to be there for 10 days and whatnot. But it turns out in this digital age, I was wrong, because it's actually now a digital platform. And it's for me, it's an opportunity to get to connect with people that are on the same subject that I get to see while I'm here. So I thank Stephen and the Real Truth About Health for getting the word out to large numbers. Even if we don't have thousands of people in the audience here, we have thousands of people in the audience there.